It's dawn in Rome. The year is 64 AD. You step outside your apartment door, and before you even open your eyes fully, it hits you. The smell. Not one smell, a wall of them, stacked on top of each other like bricks in a building that's about to collapse. Rotting fish guts from the market stalls 2 streets over. The sour reek of urine collected in clay pots on every corner because someone, somewhere, is about to use it to bleach a toga. Wood smoke. Unwashed bodies pressed together in an alley barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. And underneath all of it, the thick, sweetish stench of sewage running in an open channel, just inches from your sandals. You haven't even had breakfast yet, and you've already been exposed to more disease-causing bacteria than most people today will encounter in a year. And that's the good news, because in about 6 hours, you're going to drink water that is quietly poisoning you. You're going to walk beneath a building that could kill you simply by existing. And if nature calls, you are going to sit down next to strangers on a shared stone bench over a pit that occasionally, not often, but occasionally, kills people in ways you would not believe. This isn't the Rome of marble columns and triumphant generals you've seen in the movies. This is the Rome that 99% of people actually lived in. The Rome without the polish. The Rome where the average life expectancy hovered somewhere around 25 to 30 years. And that's if you survived infancy, which itself was a coin flip. Today, we're not talking about gladiators. We're not talking about emperors or conquest or the Colosseum. We're talking about the 3 silent killers baked into daily Roman life. Threats so ordinary, so woven into the fabric of normal, that most Romans never even saw them as dangerous. Their water, their homes, and their toilets. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why, if you were teleported into an average Roman citizen's body for just 24 hours, you would be in more physical danger than at almost any other point in your entire life. And stick around, because the third one, the toilets, has a detail so disturbing that historians still argue about how the Romans didn't figure it out sooner. We'll get there. But first, let's talk about the water you'd be drinking before you even knew what was happening to your body. Here's the thing about Rome's water system that gets left out of the highlight reel. Yes, the aqueducts were engineering marvels. Yes, some of them carried water for over 50 miles, using nothing but gravity and precision-cut stone gradients. Yes, Rome had more fresh water flowing into it per capita than most modern cities do today. But marvels of engineering don't mean much if the delivery system itself is turning that clean water into a slow-acting toxin. Because here's what almost every single one of those aqueducts fed into. Pipes made of lead. The Latin word for lead is plumbum. That's where we get the word plumbing. That's not a coincidence. That's a direct historical fingerprint. The Romans didn't just use lead occasionally. They used it constantly, deliberately, and with something close to enthusiasm. Lead was cheap, it was malleable, it was easy to solder and shape into pipes, and this is the part that should make your skin crawl. The Romans genuinely believed it was safe. Now, before we go further, let's set a curiosity hook, because this next part is where it gets genuinely disturbing. There was actually one Roman engineer, writing over 2,000 years ago, who tried to warn everyone. He described the exact symptoms of lead poisoning in horrifying detail, and Rome ignored him completely. We'll get to exactly what he wrote in a moment, and it will make you angry on behalf of an entire dead civilization. But first, you need to understand the scale of the exposure. Picture your daily routine in Rome. You wake up and drink water carried through lead pipes. You cook your food in pots that may be glazed with lead-based compounds. If you're wealthy enough to enjoy wine, and wine was consumed constantly by nearly everyone because plain water wasn't always trusted anyway, there's a good chance that wine was sweetened using something called defrutum or sapa. This was a syrup made by boiling down grape must, And the preferred vessels for boiling it? Lead pots. The chemical reaction between the acidic grape juice and the lead created lead acetate, which the Romans nicknamed sugar of lead because it was sweet, genuinely, pleasantly sweet. Sit with that for a second. The Romans had, quite literally, invented a beloved delicacy that was concentrated lead poison, and they used it to sweeten one of the most commonly consumed beverages in the empire. So let's build the full picture of a single day's exposure. Lead pipes deliver your drinking water. Lead-glazed pottery holds your food. Lead-sweetened wine touches your lips at nearly every meal, because wine was often diluted with water and consumed by adults and children alike throughout the day. Even the cosmetics some wealthy Roman women applied to their skin, particularly white face powder, contained lead carbonate, applied directly onto the face, day after day, absorbed slowly through the skin. There was no single moment of poisoning. There was no dramatic collapse. This was death by 1,000 sips, spread out across decades, embedded so deeply into the routine of daily life that nobody could isolate the cause. Now here's that engineer I mentioned. His name was Vitruvius, and he was one of the most respected architects and engineers in the entire Roman world. The guy whose writings on construction and design were treated almost like scripture for centuries afterward. And in his work De Architectura, written around 15 BC, Vitruvius made an argument that should have changed everything. He observed that the workers who handled lead, the pipe fitters, the smiths, tended to have pale, sickly complexions. He noted that lead was harmful to the human body and argued, quite explicitly, that clay pipes were safer than lead ones for carrying drinking water. He was pointing directly at the mechanism of chronic lead poisoning, nearly 2,000 years before the term chronic lead poisoning existed in any medical textbook. And Rome collectively shrugged. Why? Because clay pipes were more expensive to install at scale, more fragile, and harder to route through the dense, layered infrastructure of a city that was constantly building on top of itself. Lead was already the industry standard. It worked. It didn't visibly kill anyone at the tap. And when there's no dramatic, immediate cause and effect, civilizations, ancient or modern, tend to keep doing what's convenient. So what did chronic lead exposure actually do to the Roman body? This is where the science gets genuinely unsettling, and it's worth being precise, because the symptoms read like a slow-motion horror story. Lead accumulates in soft tissue and bone over years, and it doesn't just sit there quietly. It actively interferes with the nervous system, the reproductive system, and cognitive function. In adults, chronic exposure causes fatigue, irritability, abdominal pain so severe it was sometimes called the dry gripes, anemia, and a distinctive blue-gray line along the gums that physicians centuries later would use as a diagnostic marker. It causes memory problems, mood disturbances, and in high enough doses, seizures and death. In children, it's even worse. Lead exposure in developing brains causes measurable drops in IQ, behavioral problems, developmental delays, and, this is the detail modern researchers keep coming back to, reduced fertility and increased miscarriage rates in populations with chronic lead exposure. And this brings us to one of the most hotly debated theories in all of ancient history. Did lead poisoning contribute to the decline of the Roman aristocracy? Here's the curiosity hook worth sitting with for a moment. Some historians have pointed to the elite of Rome, the senatorial class, the wealthy families who could afford piped water, lead-glazed tableware, and sweetened wine on a daily basis, as showing patterns consistent with chronic lead exposure across generations. Reduced fertility, erratic, sometimes wildly irrational behavior recorded by contemporary historians. A documented pattern of stillbirths and childhood deaths within elite households that seems disproportionate even for an era with high infant mortality across the board. To be clear, and it's important to be honest about this, modern historians are divided on how much weight to put on this theory. It's not a settled fact. It's a compelling hypothesis, not a proven cause. Some researchers argue the lead exposure among Rome's wealthy was genuinely dangerous and likely did contribute to health problems and fertility issues among the elite. Others argue that Roman water, even moving through lead pipes, picked up enough mineral deposits and scale buildup along pipe walls that it actually created a protective barrier, meaning the actual dose reaching people's cups was lower than you'd assume from the pipe material alone. And still others point out that the wine sweetened directly with lead syrup, was almost certainly the far bigger danger, because that was concentrated, direct, and consumed constantly, completely bypassing whatever protective scale built up in the pipes. So the truth, the honest truth, is this: nobody in Rome, from the poorest tenant to the emperor himself, was fully safe from lead. But the method of exposure and the dose varied enormously depending on how much wine you drank, how wealthy you were, and how directly you were exposed to processed lead compounds versus scaled-up pipe water. Either way, if you were dropped into Rome tomorrow morning and handed a cup of water from the nearest public fountain, you would be drinking from a system engineered, quite literally, by people who believed the metal poisoning them was simply how good infrastructure worked. And that's just the water, because once you've had your poisoned drink, you still have to go home. And home, for the overwhelming majority of people living in Rome, was not a marble villa with a courtyard and a fountain. It was something called an insula, and it might be the single most dangerous place you could possibly sleep at night in the entire ancient world. Forget the villa, forget the courtyard with the little fountain and the mosaic floors you've seen in every documentary about Pompeii. That version of Roman housing existed for maybe 5% of the population. The other 95%, the shopkeepers, the laborers, the freed slaves, the immigrants pouring into the capital from every corner of the empire, lived in something called an insula. And an insula, on paper, sounds almost modern. It was a multi-story apartment block, sometimes rising 6, 7, even reportedly 9 stories high, in a city that had no elevators, no structural steel, and, as we're about to get into, often no real fire safety standards at all. Rome, at its peak, may have had over 46,000 of these insulae packed into the city, versus only about 1,800 private single-family homes. If you were an average Roman, the insula wasn't a possibility. It was your only option. Here's your curiosity hook for this section, because it's genuinely one of the wildest facts in all of Roman urban life. The safety of your apartment was directly, brutally tied to how many stairs you had to climb to get to it. The higher up you lived, the poorer you were, the cheaper your rent, and the more likely you were to die in a fire, a collapse, or simply from the building falling apart underneath you. We're going to walk through exactly why in a moment, floor by floor, and by the end, you'll understand why wealthy Romans avoided the upper levels of these buildings like the plague, because in a very real sense, they kind of were one. So let's build this apartment block from the ground up. The ground floor of an insula was usually the safest, sturdiest, and most desirable space in the whole structure, and it typically wasn't residential at all. It was commercial. Shops, taverns, bakeries, workshops, all opening directly onto the street through wide doorways, because ground floor space was stone-built, structurally reinforced, and could support serious weight and foot traffic. Sometimes a wealthier family would rent a ground floor unit attached to the shops, getting a slightly more spacious, better-built living area with actual access to running water if they were lucky. But go up one floor and the entire calculus of the building changes. Because as Roman insulae rose in height, builders, driven by cost, by speed, by a citywide housing shortage that only got worse as Rome's population swelled past 1 million people, began using cheaper and cheaper materials as they went up. The ground floor might be solid stone and concrete, but by the third, fourth, fifth floor, you were often looking at timber framing, wattle and daub walls, and increasingly thin, poorly supported flooring. This was not an accident of ignorance. Landlords knew exactly what they were doing. Building materials cost money, labor cost money, and rent for a top-floor unit crammed into a tiny room with no water access and often no proper kitchen was dirt cheap compared to a ground-floor apartment. So, the economic incentive ran in exactly the wrong direction for safety. Build the visible, prestigious ground floor to a decent standard, then cut every possible corner as you climbed, because the people living up there were poor enough that nobody with power was going to advocate on their behalf if something went wrong. And things went wrong constantly. Let's talk about collapse first, because it's the threat that gets overshadowed by fire in most retellings. But it was arguably just as constant a fear. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, described the experience of living in Rome's rented apartment blocks with a kind of grim, sarcastic horror that reads almost like modern tenant complaints, except with mortal stakes. He wrote about landlords who patched up crumbling, cracked walls and then rented the space out anyway, assuring tenants they could sleep secure, even while the building groaned and threatened to come down around them. Juvenal wrote that most of Rome was propped up by little more than thin sticks, describing how when the landlord patched a crack in an old wall, he'd tell residents to sleep easy, even as the building teetered toward collapse. This wasn't poetic exaggeration for effect. Structural collapse of insulae was a documented, recurring hazard, serious enough that it shows up repeatedly across multiple Roman sources, not just satire. Now here's a rehook for you, because this next detail is the part that always gets people. Emperors actually tried to regulate this. Augustus, reportedly disturbed by the frequency of building collapses and fires, set a legal height limit on insulae at around 70 Roman feet, roughly 20 meters, or about 6 or 7 stories. Later, Emperor Trajan reduced that limit even further, down to around 60 Roman feet, after continued disasters. Think about what that actually tells you. You don't pass height restriction laws for buildings that aren't falling down. The fact that not one, but multiple emperors across different reigns felt the need to legally cap how tall these apartment blocks could get tells you everything about how routinely uncapped greed was pushing landlords to build higher, cheaper, and more dangerously than the city's infrastructure could safely support. And even with legal limits in place, enforcement was inconsistent at best. Landlords bribed inspectors, cut corners anyway, and continued packing tenants into structurally compromised buildings because the profit margin on cramming in one more floor of tiny rented rooms outweighed the risk. A risk that, notably, fell almost entirely on the tenants, not the landlords, who often didn't live in the buildings they owned at all. Now let's talk about fire, because if collapse was the slow, looming threat, fire was the fast, violent one. And Roman insulae were basically engineered to burn. Think about the materials again. Timber framing, dry wattle and daub walls, densely packed wooden furniture, textiles, oil lamps providing the primary light source in nearly every room, and charcoal braziers used for heat and cooking because most upper-floor apartments had no proper kitchen or chimney system at all. People cooked over open flame in wooden rooms, stacked 6 stories high, connected by narrow wooden staircases, in buildings packed so closely together that the gap between one insula and the next was sometimes barely wide enough to squeeze through. Now multiply that single fire hazard by an entire street, by an entire city where this was the default construction style for the vast majority of residential buildings. This is exactly the scenario that produced the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Yes, the same year we opened this video in, which burned for 6 days, destroyed roughly 70% of the city, and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. And while that fire gets attached to dramatic stories about Emperor Nero, the underlying reason it spread so catastrophically wasn't some singular act of villainy. It was the completely ordinary, everyday construction of Rome's residential neighborhoods. Densely packed timber-heavy insulae, narrow winding streets that acted like wind tunnels for flame, and virtually no organized firefighting infrastructure capable of stopping a blaze once it truly caught. Rome did eventually respond to this. Emperor Augustus had actually created something called the Vigiles decades earlier, a corps of essentially professional firefighters and night watchmen, several thousand strong, organized specifically because building fires was such a persistent civic emergency. But even with a dedicated firefighting force, response times, water access, and the sheer density of flammable materials meant that once a fire truly got going in an insular district, it was often less about stopping the fire and more about damage control, creating fire breaks by tearing down or wetting down buildings in the fire's path and hoping it burned itself out before reaching further. So here's what your average day looks like now, purely from a shelter perspective. You wake up in a wooden-framed room on the 4th or 5th floor of a building that may have structural cracks the landlord has quietly patched over. You navigate down narrow, poorly lit wooden stairs that see heavy daily traffic and minimal maintenance. If a fire starts anywhere below you, in your building or the one pressed up against it, your options for escape are limited because there's no fire escape, and depending on the layout, potentially only one central staircase serving the entire structure. And even if nothing catastrophic happens today, you're still living inside a structure that multiple Roman emperors felt compelled to pass legislation about, because the alternative was watching the city periodically collapse and burn. And we haven't even gotten to the part of insular life that honestly disturbs people the most when they first learn about it. Because upper-floor apartments, remember, typically had no running water and no private toilet facilities, which means when nature called, and obviously it called constantly, for everyone, every single day, residents of these buildings faced a choice that ranged from inconvenient to genuinely dangerous. Some people used chamber pots, which they were then supposed to empty into designated waste receptacles or public latrines. Some people didn't, and this is where we arrive at the part of Roman daily life that's about to get significantly more disturbing than anything we've covered so far, because the reality of how human waste was actually handled in ancient Rome is stranger, filthier, and in some cases more dangerous than most people assume. We've talked about poison in the water and death from above in your own apartment, but what happens next? The reality of Roman public toilets involves shared sponges, communal seating, occasional gas explosions, and at least one recorded instance of an animal attack that sounds almost too strange to be true. We're going there right now. Okay, take a deep breath, because this is the one people always ask about after watching videos like this. And the reality is, somehow both funnier and more disturbing than the internet rumors you've probably already heard. Let's start with what Roman public toilets actually looked like, because the physical setup alone tells you almost everything you need to know about how differently the Romans thought about privacy, hygiene, and personal space. Picture a long stone bench with a row of keyhole-shaped openings cut into it, spaced closely together, side by side, sometimes accommodating a dozen or more people at once. No stalls, no dividers, no doors. You would walk into a public latrine, take a seat directly next to complete strangers, men and women in some locations, though facilities were sometimes separated by sex or by time of day, and conduct your business in full view of and full conversation with whoever happened to be sitting beside you. This wasn't seen as strange or shameful by Roman standards. It was social. People chatted. Business was discussed. It was, in a very real sense, a form of daily public gathering space, just one built directly over a continuously flowing channel of raw sewage. And that channel is where our first genuine curiosity hook of this section comes in, because underneath those stone benches ran an open water channel, part of Rome's broader sewage infrastructure, most famously connected to the enormous Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest and largest sewer systems in the ancient world, originally built centuries earlier to drain marshland before being converted into the backbone of Rome's waste removal network. Flowing water beneath the benches was meant to carry waste away continuously, and in the best-maintained latrines in the wealthiest parts of the city, this system worked reasonably well. But here's the disturbing detail that keeps coming up in serious historical and archaeological research. That same open channel wasn't a one-way system. It was a direct, open pathway connecting the sewer system back up into the toilet itself. And sewers, especially ones handling organic waste in a warm Mediterranean climate, produce gas, methane, hydrogen sulfide, flammable, foul-smelling gas that would build up in the enclosed channels beneath the latrines. Multiple ancient sources reference small fires, minor explosions, or dangerous gas buildups occurring in association with sewer systems and latrines. Some Roman sources describe protective measures, carved images of certain deities near latrines, thought to ward off bad luck or evil, which some historians interpret as, essentially, a superstitious response to a very real, very physical hazard that Romans didn't fully understand from a chemical standpoint, but absolutely experienced and feared. You were, quite literally, sitting directly above a channel that could periodically vent dangerous gas in an era with no ventilation science, no safety protocols, and open flame lighting used throughout the city at virtually all hours. Now here's the second, and frankly stranger, danger associated with the sewer connection. Things came up through it, not just gas, sometimes, disturbingly, animals. Rome's sewer network was vast, dark, largely unmonitored, and connected to the Tiber River and various waterways throughout the city. This created an environment where rats thrived. Obviously, that's expected of any sewer system in any era. But ancient accounts also describe more unsettling encounters, including references to larger creatures making their way up through sewage channels and into the latrines themselves. Roman writer Aelian, in his work on animal behavior, actually recorded an account of an octopus reportedly making its way up through a sewer connection into a fish salting establishment, a startling reminder that Rome's coastal and river-adjacent sewer systems were connected to a genuinely wild, uncontrolled underground ecosystem that occasionally intersected with daily human life in the strangest possible ways. While that particular account involves a business rather than a toilet directly, it illustrates a broader, well-documented reality. Roman sewers were permeable, uncontrolled spaces where the boundary between the city's infrastructure and the actual natural world was far thinner than most people today would ever want to imagine while using the bathroom. So, gas, open sewage, occasional unwelcome wildlife. But we haven't even gotten to the detail that most people find the single most disturbing fact about ancient Roman hygiene practices: the sponge. Here's the setup. There were no individual, disposable options for personal hygiene in the way we think of them today. Instead, Roman public latrines commonly featured a shared tool called a tessorium, essentially a natural sea sponge attached to the end of a stick. After using the toilet, a person would use this sponge on a stick, then, and this is the detail that consistently makes modern audiences audibly react, rinse it in a shared trough of water running along the front of the latrine benches, and leave it for the next person to use. Shared, communal, rinsed, not sanitized, in slow-moving or standing water that itself was in close proximity to an open sewage channel. Now, it's worth pausing here to be historically honest and precise, because this is a case where popular retellings, sometimes overstate the certainty of the details. Historians and archaeologists broadly agree that tersorium existed and was used this way, based on both textual references and archaeological finds. However, there's legitimate academic debate about exactly how universal this specific shared sponge practice was across the empire, how frequently the water was actually changed or refreshed in well-maintained facilities, and whether some individuals carried their own private sponges rather than relying entirely on communal ones. Wealthier Romans, and those who could afford it, likely had more sanitary personal alternatives, but for the general public using public latrines, the shared sponge on a stick, rinsed in shared water, appears to have been common practice. From a modern medical standpoint, the implications are exactly what you'd expect. A shared, porous, organic material moving between multiple users, rinsed in water, shared by dozens of people daily, sitting in close proximity to an open sewage channel, represents about as efficient a disease transmission mechanism as you could design if you were trying to do it on purpose. Parasitic infections, various forms of gastrointestinal illness, and general bacterial transmission would have moved through Roman populations via exactly this kind of shared, unsanitized personal hygiene infrastructure. And here's a rehook worth sitting with. Archaeological analysis of Roman-era latrine sites and sewage deposits has actually allowed researchers to study ancient parasite loads directly, examining preserved fecal matter and cesspit deposits from Roman sites across the former empire. And the findings are notable. Rather than showing improved health outcomes compared to earlier or contemporary non-Roman populations, which you might expect, given Rome's genuinely impressive investment in aqueducts, public baths, and sewer infrastructure, some researchers found that certain intestinal parasites, including whipworm and roundworm, appear to have been just as prevalent, or in some studies even more prevalent, in Roman-era populations as in pre-Roman ones. That finding surprised researchers because it runs counter to the intuitive assumption that better infrastructure automatically means better public health outcomes. The proposed explanation ties together almost everything we've covered in this video: communal bathing in water that wasn't fully sanitized, shared personal hygiene tools like the tersorium, the use of human waste as agricultural fertilizer without modern treatment processes, and even the popularity of fish-based sauces like garum, which may have carried parasites from improperly processed fish. Rome built extraordinary infrastructure, and in some ways, that infrastructure's communal, shared nature may have actually helped certain diseases and parasites spread more efficiently across a densely packed population, rather than less. So let's pull this all the way back and look at your single day in ancient Rome as a complete picture. You wake up in a wooden-framed apartment on the upper floor of a structurally questionable insula that multiple emperors passed laws attempting to regulate because buildings like it kept collapsing or burning down. You have no running water in your unit, so you either use a chamber pot or make your way down several flights of narrow, heavily trafficked wooden stairs. You drink water delivered through lead pipes, engineered by builders who were explicitly warned about the dangers by one of their own most respected architects and ignored him anyway. If you have wine with your meal, and you probably do, because wine was safer and more palatable than plain water in many contexts, there's a real chance it was sweetened using concentrated lead syrup, because it tasted good, and nobody fully understood what it was doing to their nervous system over years of consumption. And at some point during your day, nature calls, and you make your way to a public latrine where you sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers over an open sewage channel that occasionally vents dangerous gas, occasionally hosts unwelcome wildlife making its way up from the underground network below, and where you finish your business using a shared sponge that has already been used by an unknown number of other people that same day, rinsed in water that isn't nearly as clean as you'd want to believe. None of this was considered strange, dangerous, or unusual by the people actually living it. This was simply Tuesday. This was normal daily life for the overwhelming majority of people in one of the most powerful, advanced, and celebrated civilizations in human history. And that's really the core, unsettling truth this entire video has been building toward. Rome's greatness and Rome's danger weren't separate from each other. They were the same infrastructure, viewed from different angles. The same aqueducts that made Rome the envy of the ancient world also quietly poisoned its population for centuries. The same housing boom that let Rome's population explode past 1 million people also created some of the most dangerous residential buildings in ancient history. The same sewer system that made Rome more sanitary, on paper, than almost any other city of its era also created new and strange pathways for disease, gas, and even wildlife to reach directly into people's daily lives. Now here's where I want to make this personal, because up until now, we've been talking about Rome in the abstract, the water, the buildings, the toilets. But let's actually run the numbers on you specifically and figure out how long you'd genuinely last, because the answer depends enormously on one factor most people don't think about: which Rome you were dropped into. Here's the curiosity hook for this section. Your survival odds in ancient Rome didn't just depend on luck. They depended almost entirely on your social class, and the gap between the top and bottom of that ladder was so extreme that two people living 3 streets apart could have had completely different relationships with every single danger we've talked about so far. Let's break down exactly what that means, tier by tier. If you were poor, and remember, this was the overwhelming majority of Rome's population, here's your actual daily reality. You're living on the 4th or 5th floor of an insula in a single small room, possibly shared with your entire family. No kitchen, no running water, no private toilet. You're getting your water from a public fountain fed by lead pipes, and you have no alternative, because bottled or filtered water simply doesn't exist as a concept. Your food is whatever you can afford from street vendors or a small brazier fire in your room, which, remember, is also how a huge number of insular fires actually started, from unattended cooking flames in cramped wooden spaces. You have essentially no legal recourse if your landlord ignores structural cracks in the building, because tenant protections, in the modern sense, didn't exist, and landlords, who didn't even live in the buildings they owned, had little direct incentive to prioritize your safety over their profit margin. If a fire breaks out below you, your escape routes are limited. If the building's aging timber gives way, you have no warning system, no inspection agency, nothing. Your daily hygiene routine involves a shared public latrine, a communal sponge, and constant, low-level exposure to parasites and waterborne illness that your body has been dealing with, in some form, since infancy, which is actually one of the few pieces of good news in this whole story. Infant and childhood exposure to many of these pathogens meant that surviving Romans often built up genuine immunity or tolerance that a modern person, dropped in fresh with zero prior exposure, simply wouldn't have. In other words, and this is worth sitting with, an actual ancient Roman commoner may have been significantly better equipped to survive daily Roman life than you would be, specifically because their immune system had been shaped by it since birth. You, dropped in cold, with a modern immune system tuned to a completely different microbial environment, would likely get catastrophically sick within days from exposures that a native Roman's body had learned to tolerate. Now let's look at the wealthy end of the spectrum, because the gap here is honestly staggering. If you were part of Rome's elite, your home was a domus, a single-family house, often built around a central courtyard, sometimes with its own private water connection, its own kitchen, and crucially, its own private latrine, rather than a shared public one. You were still drinking water from lead pipes, and if you were wealthy enough to regularly enjoy wine sweetened with lead-based syrup, you were arguably facing more concentrated, more constant lead exposure than many poorer Romans who couldn't afford wine as a daily staple. This is one of those genuinely counterintuitive details worth re-emphasizing. Wealth did not protect you from every danger in Roman life. In the case of lead specifically, wealth may have actually increased your risk, because greater access to processed wine, lead-glazed tableware, and cosmetics meant greater cumulative exposure over a lifetime. But wealth absolutely did protect you from the housing dangers. You weren't climbing 6 flights of rickety wooden stairs. You weren't at the mercy of a landlord cutting corners on structural repairs, because you owned your home outright. Fire and collapse risk dropped dramatically, though it never fully disappeared. The Great Fire of 64 AD, after all, eventually reached even the wealthiest districts of the city before it was contained, and wealth protected you from the public latrine entirely. You had your own private toilet, connected to your own household's waste system, meaning no shared communal sponge, no sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers over an open sewage channel, and dramatically reduced exposure to whatever the person sitting next to you happened to be carrying. So here's the honest, uncomfortable answer to how long would you survive? If you were dropped into a wealthy Roman household, your immediate physical safety from fire, collapse, and communal disease exposure would actually be reasonably good, arguably better in the short term than the sanitation conditions in many rapidly industrializing cities nearly 1,800 years later. Your biggest threat would be the slow, invisible one, lead quietly accumulating in your system through the very luxuries that marked you as privileged. If you were dropped into a poor Roman household, your immediate physical safety would be dramatically worse. Fire, structural collapse, and communal disease exposure would all be live daily threats. But your relative lead exposure, ironically, might actually be somewhat lower than your wealthy counterparts, simply because you couldn't afford the lead-sweetened wine and lead-glazed dishware in the same quantities. Either way, you lose. The specific danger changes. The presence of danger does not. Now here's a genuinely interesting wrinkle in all of this that rarely makes it into surface-level retellings of Roman daily life. And it's worth pausing on, because it complicates the whole "Rome was constantly poisoning itself" narrative in an important way. Modern researchers who have studied Roman-era skeletal remains for lead content have found genuinely elevated lead levels compared to pre-Roman populations. That part is well documented and broadly agreed upon. But there's active, ongoing scientific debate about exactly how much this contributed to specific historical outcomes, like population-wide fertility decline, or the eventual weakening of the Western Roman Empire's elite class. Some researchers are cautious about drawing a straight line from "we found lead in these bones" to "this is why Rome declined," because ancient populations faced an enormous number of overlapping health stressors simultaneously. Inconsistent nutrition, high rates of infectious disease, parasitic infection, and the general risks of a pre-industrial society, making it genuinely difficult to isolate lead as a singular cause of any specific outcome versus one contributing factor. This matters because it's easy, in a video like this, to make ancient Rome sound like a place engineered entirely around its own destruction. That's not quite accurate. Rome's infrastructure, for its era, was genuinely remarkable. Multiple aqueducts moving enormous volumes of water across huge distances, a sewer system that, whatever its flaws, was more sophisticated than what most of the world would build for the next 1,000+ years, and public health measures like the Vigiles firefighting corps that represented real, functioning civic infrastructure most ancient societies simply didn't have. The disturbing part isn't that Rome was uniquely negligent. The disturbing part is that Rome was, by the standards of nearly the entire pre-modern world, doing relatively well, and it was still this dangerous. This wasn't a broken system. This was daily life, running exactly as designed, in one of history's most advanced ancient civilizations, and it was still enough to kill you through your water, your walls, or your waste. That's the detail that should actually stick with you longer than any individual gross fact about sponges or lead syrup. It's not that Rome failed at public health. It's that even a genuine ancient success story in public health and infrastructure still meant your average lifespan hovered around 25 to 30 years. Your water was quietly toxic, your apartment could kill you by simply existing, and your bathroom trips carried real biological risk every single time. Modern life, for all its complaints and frustrations, exists on the other side of literally thousands of years of trial, error, science, and infrastructure built directly in response to exactly the failures we've spent this entire video walking through. Every time you turn on a tap without a second thought, every time you walk into a building without wondering if the floor beneath you is structurally sound, every time you use a bathroom and never once think about gas buildup, shared sponges, or what might be living in the pipes below you, that's not something to take for granted. That's the end result of a species slowly, painfully learning from disasters exactly like the ones we just walked through. Because up to now, we've talked about these three dangers as separate categories: water, housing, toilets. But that's not how they actually hit you. In real Roman life, they overlapped, all day, constantly, compounding on top of each other in ways that are honestly hard to appreciate until you walk through it, hour by hour. So let's do exactly that. Let's build one full day, minute by minute, and watch how these dangers actually stack. It's the first hour after sunrise. You're waking up on a straw-filled mattress, in a room barely large enough to stand up and turn around in, on the 5th floor of an insula somewhere in the Suburra, Rome's most densely packed, most notoriously chaotic residential district. The walls around you are thin wattle and daub, patched in at least 2 places where cracks had started spreading the previous year. Your landlord assured your neighbors it was nothing to worry about. You believed him, mostly because you had no other housing option available to you anyway. Already, before you've even left your room, you are inside one of the most fire-prone, structurally questionable buildings that has ever existed in a major world city. And you don't know that. To you, this is just where you live. You make your way down the stairs, narrow, wooden, worn smooth by thousands of footsteps, poorly lit, even in daylight, because the stairwell has almost no windows. You pass the 3rd floor, then the 2nd, each one slightly better built than the one above it, each one slightly more expensive to rent than the one above it. By the time you reach the ground floor, you're passing directly through a baker's shop that's already got its ovens roaring for the morning bread. Another open flame, another fire risk, sitting directly beneath the wooden structure you just descended through. Out on the street, the morning crowd is already thick. Someone's emptying a chamber pot from an upper window, a common enough occurrence that Roman law actually had specific provisions about liability if the contents struck a passerby below. You step around the puddle without thinking much of it. This is simply the texture of the street. It would have been unusual for it not to be there. You make your way to the nearest public fountain for water. This fountain, like most of them, is fed by one of Rome's great aqueducts, maybe the Aqua Marcia, maybe the Aqua Claudia, depending on which part of the city you're in, after traveling potentially dozens of miles through stone channels before finally passing through a final stretch of lead piping to reach the actual spout you're filling your container from. You drink some immediately because you're thirsty from the walk. You fill a container to take home. You have no idea and genuinely no way of knowing that you've just taken in another small, measurable dose of a heavy metal that is going to sit in your bones and soft tissue for years, quietly working against your nervous system in ways that won't show up as an obvious symptom for a very long time, if ever, in a way you could trace back to its source. Now here's your rehook for this stretch, because it's worth pointing out something most people miss. It's not that the Romans had no concept of water quality. They absolutely did. Wealthy households sometimes kept large storage cisterns and had informed opinions about which aqueducts' water tasted best, which sources were considered heavier or lighter, which were best for cooking versus drinking. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, wrote extensively about different water sources and their perceived qualities. The problem was never a total absence of awareness about water quality. It was that the specific danger of lead, the exact mechanism Vitruvius had flagged decades earlier, simply never got prioritized over cost, convenience, and the simple fact that lead pipes worked well enough, for long enough, that the invisible damage never got connected to its actual cause. Midday arrives. You're at work. Maybe a small shop. Maybe manual labor on one of Rome's endless construction projects, because the city was in a state of nearly perpetual building and rebuilding. You break for a meal. If you can afford it, that meal might include wine, watered down, maybe sweetened with a touch of that grape syrup we talked about earlier, sapa or defrutum, boiled for hours in a lead pot until it thickened into something sweet enough to make cheap wine taste better. You have no reason to suspect the syrup itself. It's a normal, everyday ingredient, sold widely, used constantly. It tastes good. That's the whole reason it exists. By mid-afternoon, nature calls, and you make your way to the nearest public latrine. Maybe it's attached to a set of public baths. Many were, since the same water infrastructure serving the baths often fed the toilets as well, in a genuinely clever piece of engineering that reused bathwater runoff to help flush the latrine channels below. You take your seat among strangers. Conversation continues around you as if this were any other public gathering space, because in a real sense, it was one. You reach for the shared tersorium when you're done, rinse it in the trough of water running along the front of the bench, and set it back down for whoever comes next. You don't think about any of this as dangerous. You think about it as Tuesday. By evening, you're back climbing those same narrow wooden stairs, past the same worrying cracks, back up to your small room where you might cook a simple meal over a small charcoal brazier. Another open flame, in another wooden room, on another upper floor of another building that, statistically, across the city as a whole, had a real and recurring chance of catching fire or partially collapsing at some point during its working life. You go to sleep that night having consumed lead through your drinking water and quite possibly your food, having spent your day inside a building whose structural safety depended largely on how honest and diligent your landlord happened to be, and having used a bathroom facility that connected you, directly and repeatedly, to whatever pathogens the rest of your densely packed neighborhood was carrying that week. And tomorrow you'll do it again, and the day after that, for as many years as your body can withstand the accumulated weight of all three dangers combined, which, statistically, in ancient Rome, wasn't very many. Here's a rehook worth sitting with, because a lot of what we know about all of this doesn't come from Roman writers describing their own lives. It comes from the ground itself, from archaeological sites that have survived remarkably intact. The best preserved example of an actual insula, one you can genuinely walk through today, sits in Ostia Antica, the port city that once served Rome, located near the mouth of the Tiber River. Unlike Pompeii, which is famous for its private villas frozen by volcanic ash, Ostia preserved something arguably more valuable for understanding ordinary Roman life: entire blocks of multi-story apartment buildings, some still standing several stories tall, giving archaeologists and historians a direct, physical look at exactly how these buildings were constructed, floor by floor. Walking through Ostia's insulae today, you can actually see the shift in construction quality. As you move upward, through a single building. See where solid ground floor brickwork gives way to thinner walls, smaller rooms, and cheaper finishing on higher levels. You can see the layout of shared latrines, the placement of water access points, and get a genuinely tangible sense of just how cramped and utilitarian upper-floor living really was compared to the relatively spacious ground-floor commercial spaces below. Pompeii and Herculaneum, meanwhile, frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, have given historians an extraordinary, if grim, window into daily Roman sanitation specifically. Excavated latrines, cesspits, and drainage systems from these sites have been directly studied by archaeologists analyzing preserved organic material, and it's this kind of research that's actually allowed modern parasitologists to identify specific intestinal parasites present in Roman-era populations, giving real scientific weight to something that would otherwise just be historical speculation. This matters for our video today because it means everything we've covered isn't just drawn from Roman writers complaining or joking about their own conditions. Satire and rhetoric that could, in theory, be exaggerated for effect. It's backed up by physical structures you can still visit, and biological evidence pulled directly from preserved ancient waste. The lead levels found in Roman-era skeletal remains, the parasite eggs found in preserved cesspit material, the actual standing walls of insulae showing the exact construction shortcuts we've described. None of this is guesswork built entirely on ancient authors having a bad day and venting about their landlord. It's physical, measurable, and remarkably well-preserved evidence of exactly how dangerous ordinary daily life actually was. And that's really the detail that should stick with you longest after this video ends. This isn't dramatized history. This isn't an exaggerated retelling built for shock value. Every single element we've covered today, the lead pipes, the collapsing insulae, the shared sponges, the parasite loads, the emperor-mandated height restrictions, born from genuine, repeated disaster, comes from a combination of surviving Roman texts and physical, scientific archaeological evidence. Rome really was this dangerous, for this many people, for this long. This wasn't a bad week in Roman history. This was the baseline. So let's bring this all the way home. If you were dropped into an average day as an average Roman citizen, you would face slow, invisible poisoning through your own water and food. You would live inside a building that multiple emperors were forced to legislate against, because buildings just like it kept killing people through fire and collapse. And when you needed a bathroom, you'd sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers over an open sewage channel that occasionally vented dangerous gas and occasionally connected to a far stranger, far wilder underground world than most people ever stopped to imagine. Using a shared hygiene tool that modern medicine would consider an active biohazard. None of it would have seemed unusual to the people living it. That's genuinely the most unsettling part of everything we've covered today. This wasn't dysfunction. This was function. This was Rome working exactly as designed, and it was still this dangerous for this many people, for centuries. We've spent this entire video inside people's homes, their water systems, their bathrooms. But we haven't gone outside yet, and what was actually waiting in Rome's streets, the medicine, the crowds, the public dangers, and one particular practice involving public entertainment that is genuinely difficult to sit through, even just hearing about it, is significantly worse than anything we've covered today. That video is live right now. If today disturbed you even a little, go watch it next. The link is right there on your screen, and I promise you, it does not let up. Thank you for watching this one all the way to the end. If you want more deep dives like this, the disturbing, overlooked realities of history that never make the highlight reel, make sure you're subscribed, because that's exactly what this channel is built around. I'll see you in the next one.